At my own granddaughter's wedding, they handed me a name tag that said, "The Absent Old Lady." And somehow, that wasn't even the most humiliating part of the evening. I remember standing there at the entrance of the Grand Windsor Ballroom, the soft glow of crystal chandeliers reflecting off polished marble floors, the kind of place where every detail whispered elegance and money, the kind of place I had quietly paid for. The young woman at the check-in table smiled as she passed me the card, her fingers lingering just a second too long, as if she knew something I didn't. I glanced down, expecting to see my name, Margaret Whitmore, grandmother of the bride, but instead I found those 4 words written in neat, decorative script. The Absent Old Lady. For a moment, I thought it had to be a mistake, a mix-up, something easily corrected with a polite word and a quick apology. But the girl behind the table didn't look surprised when I hesitated. She just smiled again, a little tighter this time, and gestured toward the ballroom as if everything was exactly as it should be. I pinned the tag to my dress. It was a pale blue silk, tailored perfectly, the same one I had worn to my 40th anniversary dinner years ago, back when my husband was still alive and my family still looked at me with something resembling warmth. I walked into the reception without saying a word. The room was breathtaking, filled with white roses and gold accents, tables set with fine china and crystal glassware, a string quartet playing softly in the corner. It was exactly the kind of wedding Olivia had always dreamed of, exactly the kind I had made possible. Guests moved around me in clusters, laughing, sipping champagne, their voices blending into a pleasant hum, but no one stopped to greet me. No one said my name. I noticed then that my table was tucked far in the back, near the service doors where waitstaff slipped in and out carrying trays. A small detail, easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention, but I had spent a lifetime noticing the things others tried to hide. I took my seat, smoothing my dress carefully, as if the act itself could restore some sense of dignity. From across the room, I spotted my son Daniel, his arm around Rachel, both of them, laughing with a group of guests. Olivia stood nearby, radiant in her gown, her smile wide and effortless, as if this day had come together without a single compromise. None of them looked my way, not once. I folded my hands in my lap and let the noise of the room wash over me, each laugh and clink of glass settling into something colder inside my chest. I didn't react. I didn't call anyone over. I didn't ask questions. I simply sat there, wearing the name they had given me, and waited, because after 68 years, I had learned something important about moments like this. The truth always reveals itself, especially when people think you're no longer paying attention. I sat there for several minutes before anyone approached me, long enough to notice the small things that usually go unseen, the way the servers moved more comfortably around my table than the guests did, the way people's eyes drifted toward my name tag, and then quickly away, as if acknowledging it would make them complicit in something they preferred not to question. And I realized then that this was not a mistake, not a printing error or a last-minute oversight, but something deliberate, something decided long before I ever stepped into that room. Because humiliation like that does not happen by accident. It is arranged, curated, just like the centerpieces and the seating chart, and that thought settled into me quietly, like a weight I had no intention of dropping. A young couple passed by my table, the woman leaning slightly toward her partner as she whispered something behind her glass. And although I could not hear every word, I caught enough to understand the tone, enough to recognize the familiar mix of curiosity and amusement. "That is her," she said softly, "the one who paid for most of this." And the man gave a small nod, glancing at me with the kind of polite distance reserved for strangers, not family, never family. And I offered them a small, composed smile that they did not return, because by then they had already decided who I was supposed to be tonight. Across the room, the music shifted into something more lively, a signal that the reception was moving forward, that the evening would continue exactly as planned, and I watched as Daniel raised his glass, drawing attention to himself. With an ease that once made me proud, his voice carrying just enough warmth to fill the space without ever reaching me, he thanked the guests, the venue, the planners, even the caterers, naming each contribution with careful appreciation. And when he spoke about family, he spoke in broad, polished phrases that sounded right but felt empty, because my name never came up, not once, not even in passing, and I noticed Rachel beside him, smiling in that measured way of hers, her hand resting lightly on his arm as if she were guiding the rhythm of his words, making sure nothing slipped out of place. I folded my napkin more neatly across my lap, adjusting it twice until the edges aligned perfectly, a small act of control in a room where everything else had been decided for me. And as I did, I became aware of how quiet my corner of the ballroom really was, tucked away near the service entrance where the doors opened and closed in soft intervals, letting in brief glimpses of the staff. Corridors, a hidden world that functioned efficiently without ever being acknowledged, and I could not help but notice the similarity, how easily someone could be present and still treated as if they were not meant to be seen. A server approached my table then, offering a glass of champagne with a kind, almost apologetic expression, and I accepted it with a nod, my fingers steady around the stem as I lifted it slightly, not in celebration, but in observation, because by that point I understood. Something important, something that had been building quietly for years and had finally revealed itself in a single, carefully printed label pinned to my chest. They had already decided the role I was meant to play, the absent one, the silent one, the one who gives but does not belong. And the most interesting part was not that they believed it, but that they were comfortable enough to show it, out in the open, in a room full of witnesses, as if there would be no consequence, as if I would simply accept it the way I had accepted so many smaller things before. And I took a slow sip of champagne, letting the crisp taste settle before placing the glass back down exactly where it had been, because if there is one thing I have learned in a life as long as mine, it is that people reveal their intentions most clearly when they think you have already been dismissed, and I was not dismissed, not yet, not by a long shot. I remained at that table long enough to become invisible in the most precise way, not ignored by accident, but set aside with intention, like a piece of furniture that no longer matched the design of the room, and it was in that quiet space that the truth finally began to speak, not loudly, not directly, but through fragments of conversation that drifted just far enough to reach me. Two women settled at the table beside mine, their voices low but careless in the way people become when they believe no one important is listening. One of them adjusting her bracelet as she leaned in and said, "Rachel told me they almost did not invite her at all," and the other let out a soft laugh, the kind that carries more judgment than humor. "Well, you know how it is, old money, old habits. But she is not really part of their life anymore." And I felt something inside me shift, not break, but settle into a clearer shape, because those words did not come from strangers, they came from somewhere. Inside my own family, repeated and reshaped until they sounded acceptable in a room like this. I kept my gaze forward, my posture steady, my hands resting lightly on the tablecloth, but every sense sharpened, every detail aligning into something that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Because this was not about a name tag, it was about a narrative, one that had been written slowly over time and was now being performed in full view. A few minutes later, I saw Rachel move closer to that same table, her voice warm and effortless as she greeted the guests, her smile practiced, her tone perfectly measured, and I watched as one of the women leaned toward her and said something I could not fully hear, but I caught Rachel's response clearly enough. "Oh, she prefers to keep her distance these days," she said, her expression softening just slightly, as if she were offering an explanation rooted in concern rather than exclusion. "We tried, of course, but you know how she is," and the ease with which she said it, the quiet confidence in her delivery, told me everything I needed to know, because lies that are rehearsed long enough begin to sound like truth, even to the people telling them. I lowered my eyes briefly to the place card in front of me, noticing for the first time that it did not carry my full name, just a shortened version, something impersonal, something that could belong to anyone. And I realized then that my presence here had been carefully minimized in every possible way, not erased entirely, because that would have raised questions, but reduced just enough to make me irrelevant. Across the room, Olivia was making her way from table to table, greeting guests with that same bright smile, her laughter light and unburdened, and when her eyes finally passed over me, there was no recognition there, not even a flicker of hesitation, just a brief glance that moved on as quickly as it had arrived, as if I were simply another guest she did not need to remember, and that was the moment that confirmed it. More than the whispers, more than the speeches, more than the carefully chosen words, because indifference, true indifference, cannot be faked. It is either there or it is not. And in her eyes, I saw it clearly. I reached for my glass again, though I did not drink this time. Just held it between my fingers, feeling the cool surface against my skin, grounding myself in something real while everything else arranged around me felt increasingly artificial. And I thought about all the years that had led to this, all the quiet adjustments, the compromises, the moments I had chosen not to question because it seemed easier to maintain peace than to confront discomfort. And I understood now how those small decisions had accumulated into something much larger, something that had allowed this version of me to exist in their minds, the absent one, the distant one, the one who could be spoken about rather than spoken to. I set the glass down slowly, aligning it once again with the edge of the plate, and lifted my chin just slightly, not in defiance, but in recognition, because the story they were telling about me had finally reached its full shape, and now that I could see it clearly, I also understood something else, something they had not accounted for. Stories can be rewritten, but only by the person who refuses to keep playing the role they have been given. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself the smallest, almost imperceptible shift in perspective, not as the woman they believed me to be, but as the one who had been watching, listening, and waiting for the moment when the truth became undeniable. The music shifted again, softer this time, signaling the transition into dinner service. And as plates were placed and glasses refilled, I noticed how seamlessly everything moved forward without me, as if my presence had already been accounted for and then quietly dismissed. And it was in that carefully choreographed rhythm that I began to see the past more clearly than the present, not in fragments, but as a continuous line of moments I had once chosen to overlook. I remembered the first time Rachel suggested that I should rest more instead of attending a family gathering, her voice gentle, her reasoning wrapped in concern, and I had agreed without hesitation, believing it was kindness, believing it was consideration, when in reality it had been the first step in teaching everyone else that my absence was acceptable, even preferable, and from there it became easier. Birthdays I was not told about until after they had passed, holidays where my invitation arrived late or not at all. Decisions made in rooms I was no longer asked to enter, each one small enough to dismiss on its own, each one easy to excuse, until they formed a pattern too complete to ignore. I watched Daniel now as he moved between tables, his confidence steady, his smile polished in a way that reminded me of his father, but without the warmth that once grounded it, and I realized that somewhere along the way, he had learned to separate gratitude from obligation, to accept what I gave without feeling the need to acknowledge it publicly, because doing so would disrupt the version of events they had all agreed to maintain. A server placed a plate in front of me, the meal I had selected weeks earlier during a tasting I had attended alone, sitting across from a planner who had spoken to me with careful respect, unaware that the decisions we were finalizing would later be presented as if they belonged to someone else. And I looked down at the arrangement on the plate. The precision, the balance, the attention to detail, and I recognized the same effort I had poured into every part of this event, an effort that had been quietly reassigned, its origin erased in favor of a more convenient story. From the head table, I heard Olivia's voice again, light and practiced as she thanked her parents, her tone filled with appreciation that sounded genuine to anyone who did not know the full history. And I felt no anger as I listened, only a steady awareness, because emotions had long since given way to something more useful, something that allowed me to observe without interruption, to remember without distortion, and to understand without needing immediate resolution. I thought about the checks I had written over the past year, the conversations held in private where assurances were made, the promises that this day would be a reflection of family, of legacy, of continuity. And I realized how carefully those words had been chosen, how they had created an image that no longer included me in any meaningful way, not as a participant, but as a source, a means to an end that had now been fulfilled. I lifted my fork and took a small bite, more out of habit than hunger, and placed it back down with the same measured care I had used throughout the evening, because control, even in the smallest gestures, was something I intended to keep. And as I sat there, surrounded by voices that no longer reached me, I understood that this was not the beginning of their behavior. It was simply the first time they had allowed it to be seen so openly, without disguise or apology, And that realization brought with it a quiet clarity, one that settled deeper than any reaction ever could, because once something is revealed in its true form, it cannot return to what it once pretended to be, and I knew then that whatever came next would not be shaped by their expectations, but by my own decision to finally step outside the role they had written for me, a role I had unknowingly supported for far too long. By the time dessert was served, the room had grown louder, more relaxed, the kind of atmosphere that comes when people feel they have already made their impressions and no longer need to be careful, and it was in that loosened space that the final pieces began to fall into place, not through confrontation, but through the quiet carelessness of those who believed the evening had already secured its narrative. I noticed Rachel again, standing just a few feet away from my table, speaking to a man in a dark suit who carried himself with the quiet authority of someone used to handling important matters behind closed doors, and although their voices were low, the proximity was enough for certain words to reach me. Clearly, words like documents, timing, and after tonight, spoken in a tone that suggested planning rather than reflection, and I did not turn my head, did not shift in my seat, because attention is a fragile thing, and once people feel it, they begin to guard their words more carefully. Instead, I let my gaze rest on the table in front of me, listening without appearing to listen, and then I heard my name, not spoken directly, but referenced in a way that removed me from the conversation entirely. "She will not question it," Rachel said, her voice steady, almost certain, and the man gave a small nod, replying, "As long as everything is signed before the end of the quarter, there should be no complications." And that was when the clarity I had been building throughout the evening settled into something undeniable, because this was no longer about perception or social standing. This was about control, about timing, about decisions being made in advance with the assumption that I would remain exactly as they had defined me, absent, compliant, and conveniently uninformed. I reached for my glass again, not to drink, but to occupy my hands, to maintain the stillness that had served me so well so far. And I thought back to the documents I had reviewed months earlier, the conversations I had had with my own advisor, the careful language that had been explained to me in detail, language that included conditions, clauses, and provisions designed specifically for situations where trust might be misplaced. And I realized then that while they had been building their version of events, I had already taken steps of my own, steps they clearly did not know about, because if they had, they would not be speaking so freely within earshot. A soft laugh broke through my thoughts as Rachel placed a hand lightly on the man's arm, her tone shifting back into that polished warmth she wore so easily. And as they moved away, blending once again into the larger crowd, I allowed myself a slow breath, steady and controlled, because what I had just heard was not an accident. It was confirmation that everything I had suspected was not only true, but already in motion, and that realization did not bring panic or anger. It brought something far more useful, a sense of timing, because timing, I have learned, is what separates reaction from strategy. I adjusted the small name tag pinned to my dress, straightening it with deliberate care, my fingers lingering just long enough to feel the texture of the card, the weight of the words they had chosen for me. And I almost smiled, not out of amusement, but out of understanding, because they believed that label defined my role, that it limited my reach, that it reduced me to something passive and predictable, and in doing so, they had given me the one advantage. They did not realize I still possessed the ability to move without being noticed, to act without being questioned, and to decide, on my own terms, when and how this story would change direction, because for all their planning, for all their quiet conversations and carefully arranged assumptions, they had overlooked one simple truth. I had never been absent, not from this family, not from their decisions, and certainly not from what comes next. The evening continued to unfold with a kind of effortless perfection that only comes from careful planning, and I could see it now in every detail. The timing of the speeches, the transitions between courses, the way the staff anticipated each moment before it arrived, and I recognized that same precision in something else entirely, something less visible but far more deliberate. The quiet alignment of intentions that had been set in motion long before this night began. I remained seated, allowing the flow of the reception to carry on around me. And as I did, I noticed how often Rachel glanced in my direction, not directly, not in a way that would draw attention, but just enough to confirm that I was still where she expected me to be, still playing the part she had assigned. And each time our eyes nearly met, she looked away first, as if maintaining distance was part of the performance. Daniel, on the other hand, did not look at me at all, his focus fixed on the guests, the conversations, the image he was maintaining, and I understood then that his silence was not uncertainty. It was agreement, a quiet endorsement of everything that had been arranged, because absence, when it is accepted, becomes a form of participation. I adjusted the cuff of my sleeve slowly, smoothing the fabric with deliberate care, and allowed my thoughts to settle into a steady rhythm, not rushed, not reactive, but measured, because this was no longer about what had already happened. It was about what had yet to unfold, and for the first time that evening, I began to consider not just their intentions, but my own. A server approached with coffee, placing the cup gently on the table, and I thanked him with a small nod, my voice calm, my tone even, because maintaining that composure was not just habit. It was strategy, a way of ensuring that nothing about me disrupted the expectations they had built, because the moment those expectations shift, people begin to adjust, to defend, to prepare, and I had no intention of giving them that advantage. I lifted the cup and took a slow sip, the warmth grounding me, bringing a quiet clarity to everything I had observed, everything I had heard, and everything I now understood. And in that clarity, a decision began to take shape, not impulsive, not emotional, but precise, built on years of experience and a lifetime of learning when to act and when to wait. Across the room, the lights dimmed slightly as the first dance was announced, drawing everyone's attention toward the center of the floor, and I watched as Olivia stepped forward, her gown catching the light, her expression filled with the kind of joy that comes from believing everything is exactly as it should be. And for a moment, I allowed myself to remember her as a child, the way she used to run through my kitchen, the way she would reach for my hand without hesitation, and I realized how far we had all come from that version of ourselves, how much had changed without ever being acknowledged. The music began, soft and steady, and as the couple moved across the floor, the room seemed to narrow its focus, leaving the edges in a kind of quiet shadow, and that was where I remained, in that space just beyond the center, just outside the circle of attention, exactly where they believed I belonged. And I let them believe it, because there is a certain power in being underestimated, in being overlooked, in allowing others to think they understand the full extent of your presence when in fact they have only seen what you have chosen to show them. I set the cup down carefully, aligning it once more with the edge of the saucer, and rested my hands lightly in my lap, my posture unchanged, my expression calm. But inside, something had shifted completely, not in a way that could be seen, but in a way that would soon be felt. Because while they had spent this entire evening reinforcing the idea that I was no longer part of their future, they had forgotten something essential. The future they were planning still depended on decisions that had not yet been finalized, and those decisions, whether they realized it or not, were still mine to make. As the music carried on and the couple moved gracefully across the dance floor, I remained where I was, still, composed, and entirely unnoticed, and it was in that stillness that I made a quiet decision. Not to leave, not yet, but to stay long enough to see just how far they were willing to go, because people reveal the most when they believe the outcome is already secured. I let a few more minutes pass before I rose from my seat, not abruptly, not in a way that would draw attention, but with the same measured calm I had maintained all evening, smoothing the front of my dress before stepping away from the table and into the soft current of guests moving between conversations, and as I did, I noticed how easily the space adjusted around me, how no one stopped me, no one acknowledged me, as if I were part of the background rather than the family whose name filled the room. I moved slowly along the edge of the ballroom, passing tables filled with laughter and raised glasses, each one reinforcing the same carefully constructed image, until I reached a quieter corner near the hallway that led to the private rooms, a place where the noise softened just enough for conversations to carry more clearly. And that was where I heard them again, Rachel's voice first, low but unmistakable, followed by Daniel's, quieter, more restrained, as if he were choosing his words with care. "It is already arranged," Rachel said, her tone confident, almost reassuring. "The transfer will be clean, And once everything is finalized, there will not be anything left to contest. And there was a pause, a small space where hesitation might have lived, but it did not last, because Daniel responded in a way that told me everything I needed to know. She will not make a scene, he said, his voice steady, certain in a way that felt practiced. She never does. And I stood there just beyond their line of sight, not hidden, but unconsidered, listening as the final layer of their plan revealed itself without resistance. I did not move closer, did not interrupt, because interruption would have given them the opportunity to adjust, to explain, to reshape what had already been said, and I had no interest in hearing a version of the truth that had been softened for my benefit. Instead, I remained exactly where I was, allowing their confidence to carry them forward, and Rachel continued. By the time she realizes, it will already be done, her voice carrying a quiet satisfaction that did not need to be emphasized, because it was built on the assumption that I was not paying attention, that I was still sitting at that table, quietly accepting whatever role had been assigned to me. I stepped back then, just enough to remove myself from the edge of their conversation, and turned toward the hallway, my pace unhurried, my expression unchanged, because everything I needed had already been said, every assumption they had made had been confirmed, and there was nothing left for me to question. As I walked, I reached into my small evening bag and felt the familiar outline of my phone, a simple object, but one that connected me to everything they had chosen to ignore, every document, every conversation, every precaution I had taken long before this evening arrived. And for a brief moment, I allowed myself to consider how easily this could have unfolded differently, how a single honest conversation, a single moment of respect, might have changed the direction of everything that was now set in motion. But that moment passed quickly, because regret serves no purpose. When clarity has already been achieved, I paused near the doorway that led back into the ballroom. The music still playing, the laughter still rising and falling in steady waves, and I looked back just once, not at any one person, but at the room as a whole, at the carefully arranged celebration that no longer held any illusion for me. And I understood then that what came next would not be about reclaiming a place at that table. It would be about redefining the terms entirely, because they had spent this entire evening ensuring that I was seen as absent. And in doing so, they had given me the freedom to act without being watched, to decide without being questioned, and to move forward without carrying the weight of expectations that no longer applied to me. And as I stepped back into the light, returning to my seat with the same quiet composure I had maintained from the beginning, I knew that the role they had written for me had already come to an end, even if they had not realized it yet. I returned to my seat with the same measured pace, the same composed expression, and no one seemed to notice that anything had changed, which was exactly as I intended, because the most effective shifts are the ones that happen without drawing attention, the ones that unfold quietly beneath the surface, while everyone else remains focused on the performance in front of them. The music grew livelier again, the kind that invited people back onto the dance floor, and the room responded accordingly. Laughter rising, glasses clinking, conversations overlapping in a way that created a comfortable distraction, and within that distraction, I began to move differently, not physically, but in the way I observed, the way I listened, the way I connected each small detail into something larger, something that now had direction. I reached into my bag once more and carefully took out my phone, keeping it low, partially shielded by the table, not out of secrecy, but out of habit, because discretion had always served me better than display. And I opened the messages I had received earlier that week, the confirmation from my attorney, the finalized documents, the language that had been reviewed line by line to ensure there would be no ambiguity, no room for interpretation once they were enacted, and I allowed myself a brief moment to reread a single sentence, one that had seemed almost unnecessary at the time, but now felt precisely aligned with everything that had unfolded tonight. I locked the screen again and placed the phone back into my bag, not rushing, not hesitating, because the timing was no longer uncertain, it was simply approaching. Across the room, I saw Daniel and Rachel once more, now surrounded by guests who seemed eager to congratulate them not only on the wedding, but on something unspoken, something tied to the confidence they carried, the quiet assurance that their plans were progressing exactly as intended. and I noticed how Rachel's posture had relaxed even further, how her gestures had become more fluid, less guarded, as if she had already stepped into the next phase of whatever future she had imagined. And Daniel, beside her, mirrored that ease. His attention divided between conversation and observation, but never once drifting in my direction. I adjusted the name tag on my dress again, smoothing it flat, ensuring it sat exactly where it had been placed, and I felt no need to remove it, no urge to correct it, because it had already served its purpose. It had revealed far more than a proper introduction ever could, and in doing so, it had given me something far more valuable than recognition. It had given me clarity. A server passed by with a tray of small desserts, and I selected one without much thought, more out of routine than desire, placing it neatly on the plate before me. And as I picked up the fork, I realized how steady my hands were, how unaffected I felt by everything that might have once unsettled me. And I understood then that this was not detachment. It was control, a quiet, deliberate control that came from knowing exactly where I stood and exactly what remained within my reach. The evening was nearing its final transitions, the point where formalities would give way to departures, where guests would begin to gather their things and exchange final words. And I knew that whatever actions I chose to take would not need to happen here, not in this room, not in front of an audience that had already been guided toward a particular understanding, because real decisions are rarely made in public, they are executed afterward, in spaces where documentation carries more weight than performance. I placed the fork down carefully, aligning it once more with the edge of the plate, and allowed my gaze to move across the room one last time, taking in the full picture as it stood, the celebration, the carefully maintained image, the people who believed they had already secured their outcome, and I felt no urgency to disrupt it, no need to challenge it in this moment, because disruption would only serve their expectations. It would confirm the role they had assigned to me, and I had no intention of giving them that satisfaction. Instead, I remained exactly as I had been all evening, composed, observant, and quietly present, because the most decisive actions are often the ones that leave no immediate trace, the ones that unfold later, when the noise has faded and the assumptions begin to meet reality. And as I sat there, surrounded by a celebration that no longer required my participation, I understood with complete certainty that what came next would not be announced. It would simply happen, and when it did, there would be no misunderstanding about who had truly been absent and who had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to step forward in a way that could no longer be ignored. The final hour of the evening arrived with a subtle shift, one that only those paying close attention could feel, as conversations began to wind down and guests started preparing for their departures, gathering coats, exchanging final embraces, and offering the kind of closing words that always sound sincere, even when they are quickly forgotten. And I remained seated just a little longer, allowing that transition to unfold without interruption, because endings, much like beginnings, reveal more than people intend when they believe the moment is nearly over. I watched as Daniel escorted a group of guests toward the exit, his posture relaxed, his smile effortless, and Rachel stood nearby, thanking people with a warmth that seemed to grow with each passing minute, as if the success of the evening had already been confirmed in her mind. And perhaps in many ways it had. The room had been full, the celebration had been flawless, and the narrative they had built had been accepted. Without question, at least on the surface. I reached up then and gently removed the name tag from my dress, not with frustration, not with haste, but with the same careful precision I had used when placing it there earlier, and I held it between my fingers for a brief moment, looking at the words one last time, understanding now that they had never truly described me, only the version of me they needed to believe in order to move forward with their plans. And with that understanding, I folded the card once and placed it neatly into my bag, not as a keepsake, but as a reminder, because clarity, once gained, should never be discarded. I stood slowly, smoothing my dress once more, and stepped away from the table, moving toward the exit with the same quiet composure that had defined my presence all evening. And no one stopped me, no one called my name, no one asked if I was leaving, and that absence of acknowledgement, once painful, now felt like confirmation, because it meant that nothing about my departure would disrupt the version of events they had already accepted. As I reached the doorway, I paused briefly, not to look back in regret, but to take in the final image of the room, the lights, the laughter, the carefully arranged perfection that had never truly included me. And I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not of satisfaction, but of certainty, because everything I needed to know had been revealed, everything I needed to decide had already been decided, and there was nothing left for me to question. Outside, the air was cooler, the kind that clears the mind without effort, and as I stepped into it, I felt the weight of the evening settle into something steady and manageable, something that no longer demanded a reaction, only a response, and I reached into my bag once more, retrieving my phone and scrolling briefly to the message I had read earlier, the one confirming that the documents would be executed first thing Monday morning, the one outlining the exact changes that would take effect without the need for further discussion, and I did not hesitate, did not reconsider, because hesitation belongs to those who are uncertain, and I was no longer uncertain about anything. I locked the screen and returned the phone to my bag, then began walking toward the waiting car at the end of the drive, each step measured, each movement intentional, because what came next would not be dramatic, it would not be announced, and it would not require an audience. It would simply unfold, quietly and completely, in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. And as I opened the door and took my seat, I allowed myself one final thought, not about what I had lost, but about what I had chosen to reclaim, my place, my voice, and most importantly, my control over everything they had assumed was already theirs, because they had spent the entire evening convincing themselves that I was no longer part of their future. And in doing so, they had made the most significant mistake of all. They had forgotten that the future they were planning still belonged to me. And by the time they realized it, I would already be gone from it entirely, not as the absent figure they had imagined, but as the one who chose to leave before they could take anything else away.